All right, now that we've looked at adding and subtracting polynomials, we are now going to look at multiplying and dividing a polynomial by a monomial. And we're going to start off, first of all, with just a constant. Now, a constant is basically a value, a number. It has no variable attached to it. So if I look at this first example, I'd have 4 times the polynomial x squared plus 3x minus 2. So one meaning of multiplication is to think of that as 4 groups of x squared plus 3x minus 2, 4 of those polynomials. So how could I show that? Well, I've got one x squared plus 3x minus 2 modeled here. What it really means is I want 4 of those. So I'm going to clone it. Here's my second group. Clone it again. Here's my third group. And if I clone it a third time, I now get my fourth group. So now I have 4 groups of this. Okay, well, what's it mean when I simplify it? Well, now if I have 4 groups of x squared, when I rearrange those, and that's what I'm going to do now, I'm just going to slide these over here temporarily, and I'm going to move these over. So when I put them together, okay, let's not get a loop. That was part of ours, so let's keep that in there. Lost this one, didn't I? Just put that there. And move these over. There we go. So what have I got? Well, if I look now, excuse me, I have 4 groups of my x squared. So 4 times 1 is 4 x squareds. I have 4 groups of 3 x's. So that gives me 12 x's. And I have 4 groups of negative 2, which 4 times negative 2 is negative 8. So really when I look, what happens is I'm taking that 4 and I'm multiplying it by each term. And remember, when I multiply it by a term, I basically multiply the 4 by the 1, and that gives me a 4. The 4 by the 3, and that gives me my 12x. 4 by negative 2, and that gives me my negative 8x. So I take that 4 and I multiply it by each term. Another way that we say that, if we look at a second example, is that I take that term and I distribute it onto each of the terms. So really, what I would be doing here is I'd be taking that negative 3 and multiplying it by each term in the polynomial. And sometimes we show that with arrows. Sometimes I'm going to write it this way for now. 4 times the a squared, and then a negative 3 times a negative 3a, and then a negative 3 times a negative 2. So if I do those multiplications, I'll get negative 3 times 4a squared will give me negative 12a squareds. Negative 3 times negative 3 gives me a positive 9a. Negative 3 times negative 2 gives me a positive 6. Positive 6. All right, so the big idea here is, remember, you've got to distribute onto everything in the bracket, okay? And that will basically get rid of our bracket. All right, let's turn to division. What would it mean to divide by 2? Well, instead of making more groups of, I split them into groups as one of the meanings. So here I have my 4x squared minus 8x plus 2, and I want to make 2 groups out of that, 2 equal groups. So I could take this, and if I split this into 2 groups, instead of having 4x squareds, I will have 2x squareds. Instead of having 8x's, I'm going to have 2 groups of 4 x's, negative x's in this case. Instead of having 2 1's, I'm going to have 2 groups of 1 1. So really, again, what happens is we take that 2, or we take each term and we divide it into 2. So really, that is the same as taking this, dividing it by the 2, taking the 8, dividing it by the 2, taking the 2 and dividing it by the 2. And notice it didn't change the tiles at all, it just changed the numbers out in front. So what your textbook or your notes shows you is this. Okay, which ends up with 2x squareds minus 4x's in each group plus 1. All right, so key idea here if I ask you to find the quotient, is remember, you've got to divide each term in that polynomial by the constant. Okay, you can't just do one. The whole thing is being divided, right? I want to take that whole thing and make 3 equal groups out of it. So really, this is 6p over 3 minus 12 over 3. Now what happens when I do that? Well, we divide the constant by the constant, and I get 2p minus 4. All right, let's try that second one. I'm going to do exactly the same thing. The fact that it's a trinomial really doesn't matter. I'm going to take each of those terms, and notice the variable doesn't matter, and I'm going to divide it by the negative 6. Now, you've got to watch your signs here, though. A positive divided by a negative ends up being a negative 1. So again, we usually don't write the 1, r squared. A negative divided by a negative gives me a positive 3r. Negative divided by a negative gives me a positive 2. All right, so remember, when you're multiplying, distribute onto every term. When you're dividing, you got to divide each term. Okay?